Right now, sea level rise is not high on our national radar. It's not well understood in our culture. Within a few decades, it's going to be obvious to everyone that this is happening and that it's accelerating. So if you live on the coast, or if you do business on the coast, would you rather understand this problem now or after everyone in the world knows about it? When do you want to start paying attention?
Dr. Strauss, I think this is going to help provide a wake-up call for us to put in place policies to start dealing with this, and I thank you.
We have to do the job first, which is get the information to local governments, to individuals, to first responders, so that they can understand what the scenario really is. And I think today's hearing, Mr. Chairman, really goes a long way in highlighting how critically important this is to our economy. We just can't sustain this kind of level of sea level rise without a plan. We need a plan.
We've been talking in general for 20 years about the need to do something about sea level rise and storm surge, but we haven't kicked into gear and moved the needle off zero, if you will, on actual actions.
You want to be magnanimous and hand a nice future to your children and grandchildren, or do you want to make maximum profit now and build up the beach and let the rest, everyone else, fall off the edge of the earth or the edge of the water?
Barrier Islands were never meant to be developed the way that we have. And I, like everyone else who lives here, is to blame. They were never, ever meant to be built up with thousands and thousands of homes and structures. You know, we're paving paradise.
And we continue to do it.
We do. That's why I'm saying it doesn't do any good to look at past events thinking that we're going to learn something from it, because we haven't. We haven't learned anything.
You're not going to beat Mother Nature. Eventually, Mother Nature's going to win.
We're in a serious, disastrous situation here.
I don't know what I would do if I just knew that this place was going to come to an end just because folks didn't care.
The wind and the ocean currents, because of course they're involved, continually eat at this island. And we're not losing it so much as it changes. Everything doesn't just stay the same.
You need to plan for the sea level rise before it actually becomes the wolf at your door.
This is, after all, an extinction threat. We are facing a situation where a lot of places will just go away.
Sea level rise and coastal erosion are a complicated issue that in one way or another will affect everyone on Earth. Loss of coastlines, flooded communities, and loss of properties are what we think will happen. But as I've learned, the issues that no one is talking about may be a far greater threat. Transit systems, global commerce, critical infrastructures, freshwater aquifers, and whole ecosystems are at risk, globally. This is something that has to be looked at by every single one of us, and we need to decide the best course of action to deal with its effects.
This is a time when we need to respond to sea level rise. We should be doing it right now.
My interest in coastal erosion and sea level rise started sort of unexpectedly while I was shooting a video in Nantucket for a company called Coastal Recovery.
Well, coastal recovery is the process we've come across of stopping erosion or abating erosion and even reversing erosion.
Over that 4-day period, I got a crash course from experts and the guys on the front lines, and what I learned was disturbing.
Nantucket is one of the most dynamic places in the world as far as being 30 miles out in the ocean with unchecked waves coming at us. We have no rocks, we're a sand shoreline. And we were a sandbar. We were formed by a glacier, was brought here by Mother Nature, and Mother Nature's she's gonna take her course here.
I used to bring the children up here, and it's a beautiful place, and I saw what was happening with erosion, and it was really a sad situation. This part of the island's losing about 10 to 12 feet a year, even more than that some years. There's a home here we're looking at that's just been completely redone, reshingled and everything. In a one bad storm, and she's gone. Behind me, you'll see some of the houses that are now at risk. There was many more when I was here even 15 years ago. A number of them have been moved back. A number of them have been destroyed in storms, and the debris just have to be taken away.
Listening to Joe Farrell, the president of Coastal Recovery and Resolve Marine Group, made me realize just how quickly coastal erosion could destroy someone's coastal property.
How can we best protect this for the longest amount of time, causing the least amount or ideally no adverse impacts? And if we have to cause an adverse impact, how do we mitigate for that?
I spent most of my life rescuing ships, and we're having a problem getting rid of sand. Well, here's an island having a problem keeping sand. I came up with the concept of making concrete vessels, if you will, barges or shoal modules. They're below the surface, you don't see them, but they'll take the energy out of a wave before the wave hits the beach. They're not the answer for everything, but when they're put in place, you actually can build up wider beaches in some areas. So they will give you more of a buffer zone.
As we talked to a few other experts, I realized what Joe was suggesting may be a great option for Nantucket. But it got me thinking, what about the rest of the world? When I got back to Los Angeles, I decided to set off on a journey to learn all I could about this issue, not knowing at the time that this quest would take me all over the world, talking to everybody from top scientists to politicians to the average person. I called up my longtime producing partner Scott and my director of photography Chris and got them on board. A sense of dread washed over me as I started to realize that what I learned in Nantucket was probably just scratching the surface of what I would eventually discover is an extremely complex, multifaceted global issue without a clear-cut solution. My name is Jason, and I grew up in Chico, where I first found myself drawn to the water, swimming in the rivers throughout Northern California. But it was my family vacations to many coastal destinations that truly gave me a love for the ocean. When I graduated high school, I moved to Los Angeles to pursue my film career, and ended up living in a house overlooking the ocean. From there, I watched a neighbor's house collapse towards the sea due to erosion, and I found myself wondering, did I have to worry about that happening to my house? It's strange to think how that one thought many years ago has affected me today, as I spend the next 2 years documenting all I could about the subject. A subject that I'm not sure many people know about today. Discuss the topic of sea level rise?
Right. So the topic of sea level rise is one that a lot of people have heard about. The Army Corps of Engineers has a policy where whenever we study a project that's affected by rising sea levels, like this one, that we evaluate scenarios of sea level rise. And we have 3. One of them is just saying that the future sea level rise will be the historical rate. In other words, we've seen something like, in this area, 2.6 millimeters per year historically. The other 2 scenarios are increases in the rate of sea level rise. And so that's important because the beach has survived relatively well with the historical rate of sea level rise. But the question is, what will happen if the rate of sea level rise accelerates?
I think it's important that people understand the difference between global sea level rise and relative sea level rise. And relative sea level rise, again, is what is the water doing relative to the coast at that given spot. And so if the crust, if the surface of the land near a particular area of coast is sinking, subsiding, like say Louisiana, then relative sea level rise is quite rapid. And conversely, if the crust or the local topography is rising, say in Maine, northern Canada, then relative sea level rise is falling. So from a local perspective, what the relative sea level rise is doing is really what's important.
NOAA's research suggests at the current rate of sea levels rising and land sinking, by year 2100, the Gulf of Mexico could rise as much as 4.3 feet. If that happens, everything outside the protective levees, most of southeast Louisiana, would be underwater. Research also indicates that the state is losing a football field of land every 48 minutes, 16 square miles a year.
We do have scientists who have been modeling potential sea level rise would be here at Canaveral National Seashore and around the area. The models do show that there could be a 1 to 2 foot level rise by about the time of 2050 here on the ocean side, but more so, I think the impacts will be more dramatic for us on the backside of the barrier island where we have the Indian River Lagoon. And for us, we have lots of marshland and low-lying areas that will definitely be impacted by sea level rise.
The relative sea level rise is determined by averaging all the tides over a 19-year period called the mnemonic cycle. Every 19 years, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, averages all the highs and lows and calculates the mean low water for that cycle. From 1983 to 2001, the mean low average for the Chesapeake Bay tidal station went up almost 4 inches.
From a scientific standpoint, that's what you can look for as a minimum. There are a lot of projections that, based on a rate of acceleration may be occurring, that projected even higher than that. But from my standpoint, the reality of the situation is a minimum of 4 inches every 20 years. So in 50 years, 60 years, that's another foot.
Biggest question now is, based on the latest, somewhat imprecise, not necessarily inaccurate, but imprecise predictions of global climate change, what will happen over the next 20 years, 50 years, 100 years and beyond? Are we going to continue to see this rise in sea level, and will it accelerate because of loss of some of the continental glaciers or breakup of the West Antarctic ice sheet? That's the big question.
The population of the U.S. coastline greatly exceeds the population density of the rest of the country. In a 2012 publication from NOAA, over 123 million people, or 39% of the nation's population, lived in coastal shoreline counties, representing less than 10% of the U.S. land area.
I hope that the hearing contributes to restarting a national conversation on this important issue. Dr. Strauss.
In the long term, we are likely to see many feet of sea level rise and be forced to redraw the map of the United States. Sea level rise numbers can sound deceptively small, but even a few inches of sea level rise can change the odds of extreme floods much more than you would expect. And, a few feet of sea level rise is going to affect millions and millions of people.
The possible reasons for sea level rise vary greatly, from the more common thought of melting glaciers, to the thermal expansion of seawater, to the sinking of the Earth's crust due to plate tectonics. That's the reason why the relative sea level rise varies from place to place. From all my research, this has been happening for the history of Earth's oceans.
Sea level rise is not necessarily new to the Earth. And if you look back at the paleological record, you can see that sea levels have varied dramatically over geologic timescales. So right where we're standing here in Florida, right now, we're only a few feet above sea level, but there was a time when we would have been far underwater here, and another time when we might have had to go miles offshore to get to the shoreline.
We have existed as a civilized people for a unique spot where the sea level has stayed static. So our entire existence as a species of culture is rooted in the idea that the sea level stays the same. But the sea level historically, beyond humans' history, has gone up and down fast and frantically and frequently. And we're coming back into one of those periods again. Now we're driving it ourselves this time, but it's happened many, many times over the course of the history of the planet.
Besides being so clear and visual, besides being so simple in such a big threat, sea level rise is happening everywhere at the same time, all around the world. The threat that you see from sea level rise is also existential. You can't have a community with the high tide washing into it every day. It's different than having a hot week or a drought or a bad storm. You really can't persist if you're literally in the sea.
We took the conversation to the halls of Duke University, where we had the unique opportunity to talk with one of the world's most renowned and outspoken geologists in the field today. He's one of the foremost experts in what effects sea levels have on the Carolina coastlines.
My name is Orrin Pilkey, and I am a coastal geologist. The future of sea level rise is going to continue to rise. And most scientists who study this believe that there's a good chance that we can expect a rise of 3 feet. That's a lot of sea level rise. That's going to really change our coast. If you want to know how sea level rise, what 3 feet is going to do, look at the slope of the land. In North Carolina, the slope of the Outer Banks, that general region, the lower coastal plain, is about 1 to 10,000. For every foot of elevation, there's 10,000 feet of horizontal distance to get to that foot. So that means a sea level rise, well, first 1 foot is going to push the shoreline back 2 miles. 3 feet will push the shoreline back 3 times 2, and so forth.
This is when I really started to get nervous. I never realized that sea level rise would have that much of an impact. This definitely hit home for me, because for a good part of my life, I've lived within 6 miles of the coastline.
In northeastern North Carolina, in the mainland, behind the barrier island, that's where this impact is really going to be felt, as it is in South Florida, as it is on the Mississippi Delta, speaking of the U.S. But this is true for all deltas in the world. 3 feet sea level rise should be very impressive. Miami, mein Gotten Himmel, Miami is a walking dead man. I mean, Miami is doomed. And yet they're still building skyscrapers and so forth.
Imagine America without New York City. Imagine America without Miami. Imagine America without San Diego or parts of San Francisco, Seattle, Los Angeles. I mean, these are areas that are not in Houston, not just part of our national identity, but they are absolutely part of the economic fabric of this country. And if we don't do an orderly transition out of the low areas, hey, Washington, D.C., the whole Anacostia area is going to flood out. The Capitol Mall is going to flood out. I mean, there'll be water on the White House steps at some point. I mean, this is what we're looking at. And imagine a country that didn't look at this problem and do something about it ahead of time. I'll give you a perfect example. There's a municipality south of me where the current mayor is trying to facilitate a development that's on coastal lands that are less than 2 feet above sea level. Now, I happen to know that during Hurricane Andrew, the storm pushed 16 feet of water over that particular property. Why would you build houses there? It may be the stupidest place in Miami-Dade County right now to be building houses, and yet there are people trying to build houses there. This is insane. And so the government needs to stop this from happening. Just say you can't do it. The late Molly Ivins had what she called her rule of holes, and that is when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging.
According to the World Resources Institute, Florida is ground zero for sea level rise. Miami not only has the largest amount of exposed assets, but it also has the 4th largest population susceptible to sea level rise in the world.
The politicians do not recognize sea level rise. Recently, one of them from Florida said, well, this is, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know whether that number is right or not. That's nonsense. We believe scientists for other reasons. We may as well believe them when they're talking about sea level rise. We could be wrong, of course, but it's very unlikely.
The governor of Florida, Rick Scott, has watched sea level rise happen on his own property. He's seen coastal erosion with his own eyes. He's perfectly aware of what's going on. He just doesn't want to talk about it because he thinks it isn't going to play well with some of his corporate backers.
Miami-Dade's estimated beachfront property value is more than $14.7 billion, not including infrastructure.
Currently in the state of Florida, there are virtually no state regulations dealing directly with sea level rise.
At some point, we imagine Florida's going to have to address sea level rise. That hasn't happened yet. We can't continue to push development as far seaward as possible in an era of rising seas.
So we're standing at Broad Beach in Malibu in Southern California, just north of Los Angeles. And we're standing right in front of a 4,000-foot-long seawall that was built in front of the Broad Beach homes, you know, ostensibly to protect the homes from erosion. But obviously what you're seeing behind us is that it's also destroying the beach. I think one of the largest obstacles is just that, you know, the development pressures on the coast are so huge. You know, the homes behind me are worth tens of millions of dollars. And so there's a lot of pressure to build coastal development right on the beach because there's so much money to be made. It's our job to educate the development community that they're actually, over the long term, gonna have a better investment if they build farther back from shore because, you know, these homes can't be happy there's no longer a dry beach. I mean, they have to scale over rocks to go swimming, and I'm sure that's not what they bargained for when they bought their $10 million house.
Just north of Ponte Vedra, also in Northeast Florida, is a good example of the problems with permitting coastal development here in Florida. A house was permitted for construction in 1999. By the year 2007, the owners of that property, 7 years old, were already seeking a variance from state law, trying to get a permit to put armoring in front of the house that they had built there. But if you go back to the whole idea of the Coastal Construction Control Line Permitting Program, the whole focus of the program is to ensure that we're building along our coastlines in places and with methods that ensure that we won't need armoring in the future.
So in this situation, because the government failed to implement their own policy, they are in turn ironically perpetuating the culture of building closer and closer to the sea.
And it's also amazing that these people actually did get a variance and did put coastal armoring in front of these houses. Now, there are state law requirements for getting a variance to the law, and part of the requirement to get a variance from an existing law is that you, as the applicant for the variance, did not contribute to creating the hardship that you're now arguing requires a variance to the law. And in this case, I think there's a very easy argument that you built that house right there. Didn't you create that hardship when it now washes away? Everybody knows what the ocean is capable of doing. If you were not aware of that, why is that a hardship?
I would feel unfortunate that someone lost their property. I would feel unfortunate that they lost their investment. But they should have known when they built a house this close to the ocean that that potential for loss was real. And if it so happens that they end up losing their property, then to me it was just a poor investment decision. If you bought stock in a company and lost money, the government wouldn't come and renourish your assets. When you have beachfront property, I think people feel this comfort with renourishment projects and other insurance and other subsidies, but I think those are pretty misplaced. As these houses remain and as sea level rises, the public resource itself is going to be shrunk. And at many times, these people have ownership rights up to the high tide mark. And if the high tide mark's at their house, then where are you going to go on the beach? They could probably say that this is my property, I own this, you cannot be here. And this is a public resource. And so I think that's going to end up being the major problem is you're going to have a battle between public property and private property, and that public property is going to be impacted by sea level rise and those changes.
We see these geotextile sandbags that they use, usually as an emergency measure, sometimes as a temporary thing. And you go to try and rip those things out and they fall apart. And there's little tiny plastic pieces all over the beach. It's a big mess.
When I say geotextile installs, what does that make you think of?
Those are giant sandbags. They're made out of various materials, some stronger than others, but they tend to be a very, very short-term solution. Maybe if you have a storm going right then and you need a couple to protect your home for those few days, I can understand it. But as a long-term solution, they don't survive. There's a perfect story of that just north of here with a condominium complex using sandbags, and those sandbags break apart. They get into the inlets, into the rivers. They're damaging other ecosystems, and this is all to protect their condo. So if we're allowing bags to damage those resources to protect a property or a golf course, to me, that's a perfect example of private property owners taking actions that destroy public resources.
How does that make you feel?
It's disappointing. And really, I don't think there's really any ill will with them. I think they're really trying to protect their investments. I just don't think they're educated enough about what the consequences are.
In 1982, there was a report from the Corps of Engineers that dredging Oregon Inlet would hurt Hatteras Island. And they have spent, in the last 12 years, $51 million dredging Oregon Inlet. Now, I'm not saying that I oppose Oregon Inlet not being open because there's so much money, you know, for the people in that area. But it should not be done in the method that it's taken our sand.
Carol Dillon is the owner of the Outer Banks Motel on Hatteras Island, an island that is on the brink of extinction due to erosion.
So we have our issues with the government for the way we have been treated. And we also have issues with the local government for not helping us more than they have.
If you were able to sit in front of, let's say, Democrats, Congress, senators, or whoever, what would you tell them? What would you say to them?
I would say to them that you have raped our beaches. It is basically your fault because our beach is in the shape it's in. You've allowed Oregon Inlet to change the little drift of the sand that comes to Hatteras Island. They're thinking now of putting in groins to keep the inlet open. Hatteras Island would disappear.
There's no political will. If you look at the federal level, adapting to sea level rise, global change right now, you know how Washington is. It's stalemate. The forces that benefit from ignoring this are kind of overwhelming right now.
President Obama promised to begin to slow the rise of the oceans.
So I think the United States, although it's technological leader and conceptual leader, I mean, Bill Clinton kind of started a lot of this, and President Obama is trying to follow up.
Nobody has a monopoly on what is a very hard problem, but I don't have much patience for anyone who denies that this challenge is real.
I think the U.S. is taking the lead along with its European and Asian partners in developing the technology for predicting global climate change, no doubt about that. But we're kind of inactive in trying to deal with it.
We went to Washington, D.C. to see where the government agencies stand on the issue of sea level rise, as well as to get an understanding of how it's being monitored. So that led us to Kate White.
My name is Kate White. I'm with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and I'm the lead for the Climate Preparedness and Resilience Community of Practice. Yep, sea level rise is something the Corps of Engineers has been looking at for a long time. Our first guidance on sea level rise was in 1986. It was a letter of instruction to the districts to plan for and include in their engineering design changing sea levels. In 2000, we updated that guidance to look at a higher accelerated rate of sea level. In the past, say, 100 years or so, we've seen an accelerating increase in sea level change. Now, this is globally is measured all around the globe by tide gauge stations maintained by the US, by the UK, by other nations. And since about 1992, by satellite altimetry. So we have sensors above the Earth that measure the oceans and give us an idea of what that sea level is. We use 3 different scenarios of sea level change. They're all based on tide gauge records, so they're local relative sea level change. And that's built on top of global sea level rise of certain amounts. We typically have a low rate of rise, which would be about 0.2 meters by 2100. Our intermediate would be about 0.5 meters by 2100, and our high would be 1.5 meters. And that's within the range of most of the scientific literature, and lower, the high one is lower than the range that came out in the NOAA 2012 report.
And why is there such a variance in those numbers?
Well, there's a variance in the numbers because it's the physical processes driving them that make the difference. So the first one, the low scenario, is really the local tide gauge data. The intermediate scenario includes some of the warming of the ocean and increase in volume, and then the high scenario includes both warming and accelerated ice melt. So that's why the difference is. I think probably the most important thing about sea level is that people commonly see it as a continuous curve on a graph. And so they feel like any point in time you can look out and tell where you are relative, to that curve. The fact is it's a series of events, and it's variable, and so it's very hard for us to immediately pinpoint where are we. There's a big change happening. I would say there's a very active community of researchers around the world, and they work hard to come up with the best answers for us so that we can plan for engineering structures and plan for disaster response, be prepared ahead of time.
As we quickly discovered, the only thing more grim than the forecasted effects of sea level rise is the wall of resistance the scientific community is getting from certain politicians.
It's all about education and understanding the science as we go forward. What is the science of change? In North Carolina, we had a climate commission, and the interesting thing about that commission, it was a big commission, we had really good people on it. Everybody was very positive, working together up until maybe the last 6 months. And the tide started to turn, and the ugliness began to appear, and we wrote or recommended a series of pieces of legislation so that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we would have a basis for knowing how the climate is changing, an absolute framework. Sadly, that Climate Commission report was dead on arrival.
We have all read news reports at the state level, at the local level, maybe even at the federal level, that indeed some folks are trying to muzzle scientists.
The data don't lie, and we're not in the business of generating lies. We're in the business of trying to understand how things work.
While it's very clearly understood past sea level rise, going forward into the future is where a lot of the controversy begins, because it's very difficult to try to get an understanding of exactly how much sea levels are going to go up and when.
Scientists estimate that the water pouring out of this ice sheet accounts for 30% of current global sea level rise. If the entire Greenland ice sheet were to melt, the seas would rise 6 meters. Here's what 20 feet of sea level rise would look like for the East Coast. Much of Rhode Island's coastline here would be lost. Florida, ground zero for climate change?
That's my biggest fear, is that we might see very rapid sea level rise, and when all of our wastewater treatment plants are underwater, and there's buildings falling into the ocean, it's going to be a big mess.
This is not just a U.S. issue. Sea level rise will impact the world on many levels.
About 85% of the world's population in the lowest, most vulnerable places along the coast are in Asia, from China through India.
The impact of sea level rise is a major global challenge, creating internal movement and international migration and instability. Places such as Bangladesh, Vietnam, and many others need to work on solutions today.
We must act. We must act now. Action you will take will be much less expensive than action you will take tomorrow.
Trong những năm gần đây thì do cái biến đổi khí hậu thì nó
có ảnh hưởng rất lớn đến cái sản xuất là nông nghiệp nói chung, sản xuất cây lúa nói riêng của tỉnh, làm ảnh hưởng tới cái thu hẹp cái diện tích sản xuất lúa.
Dưa hấu, khoai lang, rồi đậu phộng, rồi thời gian bị thủy triều nó dâng lên á, rồi nước nó tràn vô là canh tác không được. Thành ra nó bể á, thì nó vì nước thủy triều nó dâng lên cao, nó ngập á.
The UN, along with the Vietnamese government, will invest $50 million in multiple projects over the next 6 years to try to find solutions for these ongoing issues.
We're talking about people here, we're not talking about polar bears. I think the polar bears are precious. I would not like to see them disappear, but nor would I wish to see our people disappear. Preparing our people, equipping them to be able to relocate if and when necessary with dignity, as skilled people, not as second-class citizens. We would not wish to see our people as climate change refugees.
Prevention pays, but you don't have to pay for all prevention. In other words, I think we have to move away from this assumption that everything that is prevention costs a lot of money. It's an issue of thinking about what you do and how you can decrease the risks. If you build a new road, you have a choice of building the road along the coastline, which you know is vulnerable, or you can try to build it a bit further away, but you may still have the same cost of the road.
Alors ces travaux-là, ce sont des travaux d'urgence qui ont été validés bien sûr par l'État et par les différents bureaux d'études, mais ces travaux-là ne seront pas suffisants. La protection qui nous protégera jusqu'à 2050 dans un premier temps et 2100, elle sera beaucoup plus haute, elle sera beaucoup plus large et elle sera beaucoup plus importante et volumineuse.
Cette année, on a eu une succession de tempêtes qui ont duré de mi-décembre jusqu'à la mi-mars, sans interruption, avec une hauteur de houle moyenne de 6 mètres, des pics jusqu'à 12 mètres, surtout au mois de mars. Et les 6 mètres ont été simplement que quelque chose une constante. Voilà, donc en fait on a eu une importante houle et c'est surtout ça qui a amené des masses d'eau à la destruction de la dune littorale.
Où ça nous a un peu surpris aussi, c'est qu'on était en train de travailler sur des stratégies futures et que le trait de côte aujourd'hui en 2014 était celui qui était prévu en 2040.
Et en fait, aujourd'hui, on se retrouve confronté justement à la confrontation entre ces établissements qui ont été construits très proches de la mer pour répondre à cette attente touristique et une érosion qui ne fait que s'accroître et qui est, on le sait, ça par contre, inexorable.
Lacanau, France is fighting sea level rise and storm surges today to save their town. But there are still so many questions on what is the best approach.
Je pense qu'aujourd'hui, il faut pousser vers des politiques au maximum d'adaptation par rapport au changement climatique.
Mais la problématique, c'est que l'importance du recul fait qu'on n'a plus de marge, il n'y a plus de sable, et donc on a une défense obligatoire du bâti de la Kannon Océan. En fait, c'est juste une année, un point de départ.
Do you know what is threatened the most in the continental United States? The Miami area.
Along our eastern coast, the city of Miami now floods at high tide.
Rising seas are threatening Miami Beach.
Back in the States, we find ourselves in Miami, driving through inches of seawater on one of the sunniest days we've seen. It doesn't seem like sea level rise is just a forecasted problem in Miami, but a current one.
One of the real challenges of sea level rise that a lot of people just have not yet understood is that it's not just about water coming up bit by bit, but what we're also seeing is increasingly the challenges of stormwater systems. Now here you can see an example in the background of where the stormwater system, the water from the ocean that is supposed to drain here, is supposed to be drained to the ocean. You can actually see the water backing up through that same system. So what that means is, on a day like today, it's not too deep. It's as deep as the curb and people are driving their cars through it and damaging those. But ultimately, it's not too big of a problem. It's what we call nuisance flooding. But if it were raining today, Now what you have is a situation where this stormwater drain behind me is already full of water from the ocean. There's no place for the stormwater to now drain to, and it just builds up right on these streets. And if it's bad, it will start going into the buildings.
There are a great number, I think, pressures that we're needing to respond to today with respect to climate change. Some of the most acute that we realized early on have been the influence of sea level rise on our water supplies. We sit atop a very porous geology, and that allows for movement of salt water really through the ground surface. So it does impact our water wells by increasing the salinity. In addition, sea level rise increases our groundwater elevations, and what that means is it begins to challenge all of our water management strategies. And that's significant because in Broward County, we actually occupy a land that is, for the most part, historic Everglades. And so there's a lot of drainage infrastructure that's in place that has allowed for initially agricultural development and subsequent to that, urban development.
We are right now one block off of one of the most notorious streets in Miami Beach for stormwater flooding. And the reason we're one block off that street is it's all ripped up right now. There are pipes and backhoes, and what they are doing is they're spending about $300 million right now in Miami Beach to try to address just this kind of problem.
As sea levels rise, salty water from ocean flows inward. This harms freshwater wildlife, which endangers a fragile ecosystem. The salt water flows into aquifers, which threatens the drinking water of more than 7 million Floridians. South Florida, you're getting your drinking water from this area. And it depends on this. And in terms of economic impact, all of this poses risks to Florida's $82 billion tourism industry, on which so many good jobs and livelihoods depend.
So obviously, there are great economic repercussions to losing Florida's beaches.
Florida has more day visits to its beaches than all national parks combined, to all national monuments, including the Washington Monument, the White House, and all theme parks. Combine all of that, so Disney World, SeaWorld, and so forth. Florida has a $75 billion budget. There's a struggle to get $20 million a year from the state for beach nourishment. They spend over $5 billion on roads and the maintenance. If you didn't have beaches, you wouldn't even need all the roads. How do you spend $5 billion on roads and there's a struggle to get $20 million? And in fact, have you ever heard anyone saying, I'm going to Florida for vacation because they have some good roads? People come to Florida because of the beaches. If you let beaches run down, the tourists will go somewhere else. And we know that from a really good experience, and that's Miami Beach, Florida.
Believe it or not, in the mid-1970s, Miami Beach, Florida basically had no beaches left. The land had eroded back to the hotels. So what was once a glamorous hotspot for the likes of Sinatra and Elvis had virtually disappeared. Famous hotels like the Fontainebleau went bankrupt, along with many others. In 1977, Time magazine characterized Miami Beach as a seedy backwater of bankrupt hotels. However, in 1978, Miami Beach, along with the federal government, participated in a beach nourishment project that rejuvenated the town, and paid off big time. When it was complete, the tourism tripled.
And what's Miami Beach like today? International tourists spend $3 billion a year in Miami Beach. The taxes that go to all levels of government from that dwarf the $50 million cost of the beach nourishment. And that beach nourishment's more than 30 years old. They've had some minor renourishments.
In some ways, Florida's beaches are to Florida like mountains are to Colorado. Florida will never let their beaches completely disappear. We have over 100 million tourists a year. More people visit Florida's beaches than visit the beaches in any country on earth. So in the state of Florida, not in the United States, just Florida's beaches are the most popular beaches in the world. They drive the coastal economies all over the state. So we believe that the state will continue to renourish as an adaptation tool.
By saying adaptation tools, he's referring to ways of combating coastal erosion. And there are many of these. Some are Renourishment projects, modular breakwater systems, artificial reefs, jetties, geotextiles, seawalls, levees, and several others. But first, let's talk about beach nourishment.
In fact, it's probably the most viable adaptation tool we have in the state of Florida to combat sea level rise on our beaches.
Beach nourishment basically means transferring outside sediment, typically sand, to an eroding beach to widen it out. This approach is thought to help the beach be more resilient to erosion and help to create a larger beach for tourism. It sounds simple, but is it?
Beach nourishment or beach fill will probably buy some time, but won't ultimately solve the problem. And in places like Florida, they're already running out of sand as they try to nourish the beaches. It's becoming too expensive to truck sand in from too far away. So I think those will be short-term strategies, but not ultimately long-term strategies.
For some of the proponents to beach renourishment, putting sand back on the beach and building armored type walls and seawalls, those people, that's a lot of money. Those groups have a lot of lobbyists, there's a lot of money involved in that, so they definitely want to see that continue. And then anytime you're doing sand renourishment, if you're getting continual erosion in that area, that sand's getting washed off the beach and pulled back onto nearshore reefs and actually smothering and killing marine life and nearshore coral reefs. So a lot of the people that want to continue to use those type of products are usually the ones that are just making a big paycheck from it.
Probably a misconception of beach restoration is that it's only being done for a local community or perhaps even for only a private group, the beachfront property owners. And really nothing could be farther from the truth. These beaches generate significant tourism economies. This hotel brings in $1 million a year in tourism taxes. And that tax goes back to the county to be used for purposes of restoring the coastline. People come from all over the country and all over the world to visit United States beaches. And we need to realize that restoring them is in the federal interest.
Well, there's where much of it lies. The feds are pumping an awful lot of money into the beaches.
The government spends millions of dollars a year on beach nourishment projects.
We've got to convince maybe we have to convince our representative in Kansas to stop giving money for beach nourishment. Let's use some common sense here. That doesn't mean just to abandon them. Let's take that same money and move some buildings and things like that.
I mean, I don't see that we're harming the island. The beach nourishment is just like a man improving his property, just like a man putting a coat of paint on his house or doing something to improve his business. It's just as simple as that.
So here's the million-dollar question. With the multi-million-dollar price tag, what exactly is causing beach erosion?
The main factor is humans. Once you put a fixed structure and really a moving frame of reference in a natural state, you suddenly have coastal erosion.
But that doesn't just mean residential and commercial properties.
There are a number of locations around the country where navigation projects have negatively impacted the downdrift beaches. Many of our ports and harbors were stabilized with jetties 100 years or more ago. For example, the Charleston Harbor was stabilized in the late 1800s because it was a treacherous inlet full of shoals. There were shipwrecks all over the place, and the federal interest was in navigation. They wanted the ships to be able to traverse the inlet safely, and they wanted to keep sand out of that shipping channel. So they did that by building very long jetties. And at Charleston Harbor, it's an extreme example. The jetties are 3 miles long. So any sediment that is being transported along shore in the longshore current is trapped by the jetties on the north side of the harbor, thereby starving the downdrift beaches.
There's not a general rule for all erosion, but the vast majority of erosion is caused because you have a deficit of sand. Now, why do you have a deficit of sand? 3 major reasons. One is you've cut off the supply of sand. Man has cut off the supply of sand. So we build dams in Southern California, let's say. It traps the sand behind it. The sand that used to come down the rivers in Southern California now are trapped behind the dam. Even seaward of the dam in the river system that's not, the sand hadn't been stopped by the dam, we allow people to mine it, sand to make concrete. And so that sand doesn't get to the coast. So you cut off the sand supply. Then, of course, most sand along most coasts, it flows along the coast Like in the state of Florida, most of the sand flows from the north to the south. And anything that you do to interrupt that flow causes erosion.
I think the biggest misconception is that you can build jetties and groins and bulkheads and stop the erosion, and you're not going to stop it. Once you destroy the natural habitat of these indigenous species of plants and think that by just dumping a load of sand in its place that you're going to restore the integrity of that sand dune, it's not going to happen.
As we look down the beach here, I mean, this is about as healthy as it gets. It's completely natural, and so you can see we've got these beautiful tall dune system. What that does is it just protects the inland from storms, but also provides habitat for nesting sea turtles. All this other area that you're looking at, that's also natural habitat for animals. And so protecting this coastal system and allowing it not to manipulate it basically allows everything to function as it's supposed to.
We are better educated in this state, I think, than many states to the north about the problem of shoreline erosion and the fact that it's inevitable and it will continue. So what we need to do is start objecting to why should we pay for nourished beaches. They're very costly. As I mentioned, the one in north of Rodanthe is $10 million a mile, and it's going to last three years, it's expected to. So I think I see some turmoil here in the society, wondering about why are we spending this much money on the people who live on the Outer Banks. We're not against them. They're not our enemy or something like that. And most of us in North Carolina enjoy our vacations out there. But when you look at the cost of a year-round citizen on the Outer Banks, it's huge compared to what it is here.
We get a bad ocean storm, these 3 motels here are going to be gone. We had a meeting about a month ago, and they were saying they want to do beach nourishment in Buxton, but they can't get permits. It would take 3 years to get a permit, or maybe 2 at the least. And I spoke up and I said, we don't have 3 years. We don't have a year. You're going to have an inlet. I said, forget the motels and forget the private homes that are going in the water. You're going to have an inlet right north of these motels. It doesn't seem to bother the people that have power. And what should have happened when they nourished the Rodanthe area, that dredge should have come here. But they left, and left us in the ocean.
Been working this coast recovery for a good 15 years, the environment has still been tough for permitting. And do I want to beat my head against the wall to prove to a government here or there that we can do this? Not until they realize the value that we have.
And that is one of the biggest issues concerning sea level rise. Major protection projects will take several years in development, modeling, and testing before anything can be implemented. Because the way the permit process works, ideally, we should be developing solutions today for events that may happen 50 to 100 years from now.
I think most of the country needs to quit waiting on the federal level to do something for them and get out there and do it on their own. My own opinion, I would rather find ways to get them out of it, i.e. 5 years of a permitting process, and they don't even contribute any dollars. Thank you very much. Give me 5 minutes of permitting and we'll use our own dollars. Get out of my way. The Army, we used to say lead, follow, or get the hell out of the way, and I know what I want.
Our permit pathway has led sometimes to take 20 years to do what would appear to be a simple project. From an engineering standpoint, to be quite honest, it is a relatively simple process. From a people perspective, it's never a simple process. The permitting pathway requires multiple checks and balances of dozens of agencies who believe that they have a dog in the fight in the ear of some part of our citizenry. Everybody does have a voice, and that's what we all believe. However, it sometimes leads to unintended consequences, which is sometimes it takes 20 years to make a decision.
We find ourselves once again on the shores of Nantucket, seeing just how quickly the erosion is devastating people's property.
Up in the top, you see this black line running parallel with the top. If you look over, you'll see an irrigation head in another zone out here. So if you think of it, if you think up vertically, right up above where we're standing used to be somebody's backyard. And then the bluff obviously would have been farther out here. But they've lost quite a bit of land down in here. And you can see it's not that attractive. You have all this stuff left laying around because this stuff just falls down the slope and gets into the environment. It's in rough shape, and it's just going to keep on encroaching the more sand it pulls away. But on the other hand, this is all sand and nutrients for the downward drift, for the downward beaches. It's historically has fed the beaches. There's erosion. So a lot of people are concerned that if you don't allow it to erode, there won't be any beach left. So it's a very, you're dealing with people's emotions here on the environment. And so you're trying to find a solution that makes everyone happy. I think that's probably one of the hardest things we're facing right now, is what's going to work. But it's pretty obvious that it's happening, and it's happening fast, and something needs to be done quickly. And fighting and squabbling over it's not going to do anything. We need to get some science involved here and start taking some steps to make things happen.
Okay, so the solution should be pretty straightforward, right? Not even close.
In my opinion, we have no choice but to retreat from Barrier Island.
Coastal management is a complex process. It cannot be oversimplified into simply saying we should retreat from the coast.
We cannot possibly build enough walls and to hold these barrier islands in place. You'd have to have walls around all barrier islands, and even so, there'll be water coming up from below and so forth and so on. Retreat is absolutely essential.
We have been handed a coastal system that has been poorly managed in the past. But that doesn't mean I'm going to throw my hands up in the air and say, they made mistakes in the past, and now they have to deal with them. It's our job to use the best science available to us to try to make our coastal resources better today than they were in the past.
The ability to save properties and the value there going forward, phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. We don't have to retreat, you just think smart.
I'm not for full retreat. I think we have to use our science. We know where the new inlets will be. In fact, we have mapped all those locations. We know exactly where they've been in the past. We know a vulnerability. We can put a probability on where these things are going to open. But we have a history of filling the inlets and building on those sites. Well, that's probably not a very good idea. We can do better than that.
There's a dawning consciousness that in response to events like Hurricane Irene and Superstorm Sandy, that putting it back the way it was is not necessarily the right answer. People are still going ahead and trucking out lots of sand, but when they find it washes away year after year, and they realize how much money they're spending to do that, and how it's probably a losing game longer term, meaning that this extinction threat is going to become very real. We can't keep just putting Band-Aids out. Then attitudes change, and people will start saying, let's do something else. We're not just going to put out more sand. How about we start, for example, a relocation discussion?
Retreat is often discussed as a mechanism to combat, or at least deal with or adapt to, sea level rise or climate change on the eroding coast. Is retreat a viable option?
Well, retreat is a safe option. It is less expensive for the entire region if they simply say there shall be no residences placed within a quarter of a mile of the shore. It isn't going to appeal to people that would like to live closer to the shore. I think as an ocean engineer, I would have to say, let us seek some technological ways to increase security without having to rely upon retreat.
I'm a big believer in one size does not fit all. I think even in the state of North Carolina, where I'm from, we have different kinds of erosion rates. We have different kinds of erosion drivers. We have land that's rising, land that's sinking. We have all kinds of differences that make it such that you can't just say, here's how we're going to fix this. In some places there may be no solution that is viable. In other places there may be lots of solutions that are viable. You got to pick what really works in a given situation.
Well, I would agree that retreat is a very challenging in a community such as ours. We have the coastline to the east, and we have the Everglades water conservation areas to the west, and those are completely protected. So our built environment, our urban footprint is the footprint that we have. And shoreline protection is going to continue to be quite important to our communities.
When you're dealing on a barrier island that's moving and you put a fixed position in it, you're going to have problems. So there's no global answer to that. We are going to live along the coast. There are areas in which our footprint is so big and our commitment is to that area that we've got to have engineering ways of protecting that property and still trying to provide a healthy, natural appearing shoreline. There are other areas of the coast, maybe we shouldn't be there.
I think a bigger problem facing coastal management is what happens with our storms. You know, in some of even the worst case predictions for sea level rise, I see numbers of 1 meter or 2 meters over the next 100 years. Well, we get a 1 meter or 2 meter surge or an inundation of water from a storm in 3 or 4 hours. And that's an area that I think we really need to work on. And again, I'm not ignoring sea level rise, but the impacts of storms, the storminess, how often we might see them, are they increasing in magnitude, and then the response of the land, the coastal regions around it to those storms, that to me is an area that we really need to invest a lot of time and effort on.
Our crew found themselves in the aftermath of Typhoon Yolanda, and this really drove home the immediate risk of storm surge.
We thought it's only the wind. If it's only the wind, then all of us definitely will be able to go through this. We didn't imagine the storm surge would rise that high. The water from the sea, the water from the bay, they met together. It was like this high already. Fortunately, the sea and the water subsided immediately. We almost died.
Today I'm directing our federal agencies to begin factoring climate resilience into our international development programs and investments. And I'm announcing a new effort to deploy the unique scientific and technological capabilities of the United States, from climate data to early warning systems. This effort includes a new partnership that will draw on the resources and expertise of our leading private sector companies and philanthropies to help vulnerable nations better prepare for weather-related disasters and better plan for long-term threats like steadily rising seas.
I think Hurricane Katrina taught us all the importance of looking at risk and uncertainty. Hurricane Sandy taught us all that we really need to understand the resilience of a system.
I think the storm Sandy educated a lot of folks on what the situation is when you put sand on a beach and when it works like it's supposed to. You could see towns next door to each other on the Jersey Shore where a beach had been built up and houses had been elevated and the damages were minimal, and right next door where it hadn't been done, there were no dunes in place, houses were devastated. So I think anybody who can't see that doesn't want to see that is all I got to say about it.
When Katrina came ashore in New Orleans, I had already moved up to Corps headquarters. And, you know, stepping back a little bit, everybody I know inside the Corps of Engineers felt personal sorrow at how that unfolded. There were walls, flood walls that failed. They, even if you weren't involved in that project, never had any involvement, but you're with the Corps of Engineers, you took that personal.
There's no denying how dangerous flooding can be to a community's infrastructure. But it's not just the immediate inundation of water that poses the immediate threat. It's the secondary effects, like chemicals, petroleum, sewage, and other toxins contaminating the water that further escalates the crisis.
New Orleans is sitting in the bowl in the middle, below sea level, and it's a hard system to protect. So since then, there's been a lot of work. The levees have all been increased in height, reinforced. The walls have all been reinforced or replaced, and a dike system has gone in to be able to cut off the water that goes into Pontchartrain. And there's also been increased pumping capabilities brought into the city. So the city, from an engineering point of view, is much better prepared to handle a hurricane in the future. And all that work happened, dramatically within a 10-year period. Now, Sandy is a different story because it wasn't a failure of engineering works. It was a storm that had wide impact across a broad area, and a lot of communities that had no protection failed and had damages. It's just a case where we haven't had that scale of hurricane coming up the eastern seaboard in so long and hitting those areas that people forget.
One of the problems you have with coastal erosion projects is people don't think about their beach until they're having a problem. So instead of being proactive and thinking about stabilizing their beaches before the storm ever hits, doing things like reef balls and things that are very long-term of nature, people think about, oh my God, the storm just hit, I gotta do something fast. They don't think about it. And unfortunately, that's not the way to manage this stuff. It should be managed by thinking in advance before we have problems.
Well, I think any planning process needs to take into account the critical infrastructure. I mean, for instance, a lot of our wastewater treatment plants are just feet above sea level today. Those are really big issues that need to be resolved, hopefully before those sewage treatment plants fall into the ocean. Looking at coastal power plants and wastewater treatment plants, there's highways right adjacent to the shoreline. All of that stuff needs to be taken into account and economically, not look at the 4-year time horizon, but look at the 40 to 80 to 100-year time horizon.
With these intense storm surges, cities and towns are being paralyzed with damages to permanent structures, transit systems, and nuclear power plants.
5 million people take New York City subways every day, and this morning the entire system is shut down.
I think Sandy was the spotlight on how unprepared we are in these cities with all the tunnels and the whole subterranean network of water and sewer and power that's underground.
In 2011, Fukushima nuclear power plant was hit by a tsunami. Radioactive materials began to be released into the environment. Now that was caused by an earthquake, but the same consequences could happen with a powerful storm surge. There are approximately 30 nuclear power plants in harm's way in the United States, and countless more globally.
One of our newest projects is to take a look at the coastal storm risk management around all 4 coasts of the United States, the Atlantic, the Gulf, the Pacific, and also the Great Lakes, for how susceptible are our nuclear power plants. And there are 30 some odd that we would consider coastal power plants on all those coasts. And we're looking at storm surge analysis and tsunami analysis. So what is the safety opportunities going forward in all of those plants? So that's one of our newest projects.
You're saying a 10,000-year storm is something that they have you guys look at? What would that even look like?
Yeah, it looks horrible. And so I can only tell you so much because it's Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, it's far larger than a 500-year storm, but it's all the basic components. It's wave setup, wind setup, and all the rest of what that magnitude would be. And from a modeling standpoint, it really is. It has to do with probabilities. So as opposed to 1 in 500, doesn't mean it'll only happen once in 500 years. It's of that magnitude is capable. And so when we say 1 in 10,000, it's just the scale in terms of wind waves, not it's really only going to happen once every 10,000 years, because a 1 in 100-year storm can happen 4 times a year. It's just of that magnitude. It isn't a debate of equals. It really is a debate of us determining what is our critical infrastructure that we need to see protected. Let's focus on planning for that future inevitability. And then we can have B and C priorities going forward.
If there's value in projecting sea level rise to 100 years from now or 30 years from now, that's the value. If you're building a hospital out there, you don't want that first floor in the water. And we better know what that response is going to be, because we're building structures that are 50 and 100-year structures. And so I don't think our exercise of developing that 100-year sea level report for North Carolina was a waste. I think that was an important step, but we have to keep it in perspective. We're building stuff out there that should never be built out there. It will be a disaster. And in these cities, when the disaster hits, nobody's going to care about the Outer Banks and these small villages, because the disaster is going to be far greater, and the political clout's going to come from the urban areas, not from the rural areas. And so even more important that North Carolina get it together, because we're going to be on our own.
I am willing to work with anybody. Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Libertarians, Greens, anybody to combat this threat on behalf of our kids.
One interesting story of retreat happened in 1999. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was successfully relocated 2,900 feet from the spot on which it had stood since 1870.
They built it here. They knew where the shoreline was then, and this shoreline did this. So there were times when the shoreline was up a little closer and then it'd build out and so forth. But the net movement was this way.
In 1969, the Navy built a base on the property adjacent to the lighthouse. As the beach eroded to the houses on the base, the Navy wanted to install jetties to protect the properties.
And the Park Service said, no, if you build that jetty, you're going to take our lighthouse out. Well, okay, we'll build 3 jetties then. And so the 3rd jetty was up here immediately in front of the lighthouse, and it's still there in pieces. And the downstream started to cut in and erode severely back. And by this time, the shoreline was up almost against the lighthouse. It was very clear that the days were numbered. And if that lighthouse was going to be saved, they had to move it. The locals didn't want it moved. They wanted it right where it was, and a big conflict developed. And there was a big effort to educate the public about, if you really want this thing, you better move it. And the irony was that summer had record tourism. People came from all over the world to watch that lighthouse be moved. And after it was moved, some of the people who were the biggest opponents to it would come up to me and say, damn, we made so much money that summer. How about if we just kept this thing on the track and kept moving it? It was a success story in retreat. I thought it would set a policy for the state. Once it was done, everybody forgot about it.
Currently, shore protection projects range from a few years to about 50 years. I think the Corps of Engineers New York District has some 50-year projects along the south shore of Long Island. I think the longer the lifespan, the bigger the thinking. I think we should do 50 and 100-year projects and beyond, if it's possible.
Sea level rise fight starts here, right now, and I'm really proud to be a part of it.
This marks Norfolk's largest single investment to date in our beaches.
The Norfolk project will cost $18.5 million, covering roughly 7 miles of coastline.
The project will widen the recreational area by 60 feet, enhancing residents and visitors' beach experience. It will also protect valuable property from coastal storms and erosion.
The recent North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study identified Norfolk, Virginia as a high-risk area. This includes the largest naval base in the continental United States.
We have a coastal storm damage reduction mission, the Corps does, and what that means is that we have a mission to study alternatives to reduce damage from storms on the coastline of the United States. So we're in Flagler Beach. This is a site that we've completed a study recently looking at coastal storm damage reduction alternatives. And in this case, that means beach nourishment or adding sand to the beach.
There are a few inlets in this country that utilize sand bypassing systems, which is actually a fixed plant that excavates sand from one side of the inlet, pumps it across the inlet, either on a bridge or on the seafloor of the inlet, and onto the downdrift beach. These sand bypassing systems work well at small inlets, but they need to be maintained. As with anything in the saltwater environment, they're very difficult to keep them functioning. In the middle of that spectrum, we have the beach preservation zone. All right, so in my mind, a successful project could include dune restoration, beach renourishment, and perhaps even some erosion control structures. If cost effectiveness is important and holding that sand on the beach for a longer period of time is important to the community, then sometimes erosion control structures are necessary to keep sand in the project area longer than it would stay there naturally. So it's this engineering redundancy, multiple layers of protection that provides for excellent coastal resilience for these communities.
Well, so with regards to sand management, I think it's important to note that Broward County is really the southern extent of sea turtle nesting habitat on our east coast. So the preservation of those beaches actually provides a very significant and necessary preservation of habitat to support endangered and threatened sea turtle populations. But we also have a great need to support and protect our hard bottom, our coral reefs that are offshore. It's a very important element in the way of our natural systems, our fisheries, whether they're recreational or commercial. It's the basis for a very significant tourism industry, and reefs also help to protect our shoreline from tidal energy and wave energy that causes erosion. So there's a number of efforts that are underway. First of all, as we undertake our beach management projects, we have substantially scaled those to the minimum extent possible so as to help prevent any of that sand placement having an impact on our coral reefs.
Basically, if you think about any of the islands you've seen in the Caribbean that have these beautiful beaches, almost all of them have a fringing coral reef on it. So we had this idea of putting down the reef balls, planting them, in this case, was full of corals because the corals would continue to grow and make even more of a breakwater. But instead of it being something like putting a groin out where it stops the flow of sand and creates a beach on one side, but then there's no sand on the other side and then you have a big erosion problem, now you're shore parallel, so everything is just adding sand to the beach and you're not taking it away from anybody. And it's a permanent solution. If you pump sand, for example, that only lasts until the next storm and it blows downstream and then you've lost your sand and you got to do it again. Every time you do it, it's $3 million. So if you have a reef there, that protects it naturally.
There are several advantages to thinking about modular breakwater systems. The biggest one, best one, is that they are modular and movable and can be temporary. Let's say we deploy them as shallowly submerged detached breakwaters in a certain configuration, maybe based on a series of modeling experiments, such as the one that I am conducting now for Indian River County, designed to limit wave action, reduce wave energy, trap a little sand without creating significant downdrift erosion. And we've shown by our model results it's possible.
There's always a potential you put something in the wrong place and the modules can cause a problem, a hot spot, erosion someplace else, and unintended consequences. That's why these modules are so important. We can reposition or remove them. We can dewater them and just change their angle, position them someplace different, which is a nice thing. So even in the permitting, we're not looking for a permanent placement. They can last longer than me and you will ever live, but they can be always removed and replaced or repositioned, however. So that's the nicest thing about them. because things change and the oceans are getting a bit, deeper, or the coastlines are sinking, whatever the heck is going on. So you just de-water them in 10 or 15 years, put them back down on a little higher plateau, and they have to do the same effect as what they were doing 15, 20 years before.
Surfrider actually built an artificial surfing reef right off LAX here in El Segundo to try to mitigate for a lost surfing spot. And after 10 years, that reef didn't work at all to make surf. So we ultimately had to take it out. And it cost us more money to take it out than it did to put it in. So we learned that lesson the hard way.
When you make a decision and nothing happens, you're safe. If you make a decision and a bad thing happens, that's the end of your career. People are reluctant to take that risk.
Maybe we should describe these breakwater modules as kind of the first principle of medical care, do no harm. You can design them to do no harm, and quite possibly, if you're clever about their placement and have the flexibility of moving these around, you can create some benefit at relatively low expense.
Again, you need a shoreline where the sand is coming at you. You start in an area below the threatened areas, and as that sand's coming by, you can build it up. Now, when you have a 20, 30-foot surge, it's too late to try to be protecting, but if you have them in position for a number of years before on a beach that's still always feeding you sand, you can make that beach wider and you can put up some sand dunes.
So it's a kind of an uphill battle to test these new ideas, but certainly we need new concepts.
I think it needs to be all of the above. I think relocation and retreat need to be seriously considered in certain areas, particularly after a storm when there's been some damage. Perhaps rolling easements would be an interesting idea to let people know that the high tide mark is moving closer and closer to their property, and possibly they need to consider an easement and understand that that's going to continue to move, and at some point they may lose their property. But at least they might get some money up front, and they might be able to recoup some of that loss instead of a catastrophic loss all at one time and saying you can never build again.
What we need in this fight are citizens who will stand up and speak up and compel us to do what this moment demands. Understand, this is not just a job for politicians.
The big opportunity here is about helping people realize they do have options. So often we see these discussions and people shut down. They can't really engage because it is that tricky.
We have a hard time imagining what we don't have. And so imagination is the biggest obstacle to us moving forward. When people can get their head around this idea, when they can envision it, when they can see it, that's when people will start doing something about it. It has to be real in their imaginations before they can make it real in their lives. Now, we can't stop sea level rise, we know that, but we don't have to get caught by surprise by it. We don't have to operate in a panic. There's a lot of things we can do that'll make life livable and bearable and downright enjoyable over the next 30 years. If we don't do those things now, it's going to end badly.
You know, there's nothing more dramatic than the coastline. That's where water, waves, and land and wind all meet. And it's always changing, it's very dynamic, and it's very unpredictable. We're developing tools to be able to do a better job of predicting, but managing something like that, it's like we're trying to manage a whole bunch of cats. They're badly behaved.
The individual residents, they can urge their elected officials to take climate change seriously and to begin to formalize processes within local government that help prepare those communities for the pressures that are very local.
Getting involved any way you can, educating yourself is the most important thing. And this is a complex subject. It's taken me 25 years to fully understand everything that's going on with coastal processes and management. And even then, I'm not an expert. There are people that know even more than me about some of this stuff. And you got to listen to everybody, you know, because we're learning new things all the time.
This gets to the question of what is the role of science? And scientists will produce certain amounts of information, but it's up to society to figure out how to use that information with scientists' input about what it might mean. Scientists shouldn't use the word should.
Sometimes people get upset about sea level rise warnings.
They want to shoot the messenger. They worry that the information about possible sea level rise could harm communities. My feeling is that we need those warnings to save lives and to save property. So we need a long-term warning for a long-term problem. Doesn't mean we have to leave the shore, but we have to understand what's coming because it's a totally changed world, and we're going to have to change the way we live on the coast if we're going to make it safe.
When I started this project, I never wanted to tell anybody what to think one way or the other. I just wanted to get people to think. Every area is different, every coastline is different, every situation is different. We all have to look towards the future and see the world's a changing place. Whatever the cause is, whatever the reasons, we just need to look at that and decide what the best course of actions for our individual piece of it is. You know, we really got to think what kind of world we want to hand to our kids. I have kids, a lot of my friends have kids. Do we want to hand them a decent future, or do we want to hand them a world of polluted, broken down cities that have been, you know, flooded out because of storm surge or myriad of reasons? Our goal is to start a conversation and possibly further that conversation through our website as we add more material. We just all need to start thinking about what we're going to do about coastal erosion, sea level rise, and our future in general. So let's all just start talking about it.
And don't you think you could give that to me? When the night comes, when the sun sets, when the waves come crashing down, when the pain in your heart aches, when the pain in your heart aches, by then, babe, it's too when the night comes, when the sun sets, and the waves come crashing down, when the pain in your heart